So hello, everybody. Welcome to Service Design Drinks Berlin. Thank you for introducing. If you've got other great resources to share with us throughout the event, we would love to also hear those and see those. We will collect a lot of these and we'll be able to share them out with you a little bit later on. So keep them coming. If you've got great answers to the questions or great links or great articles for us to read, we love to share those within the community, and we love to get everyone's opinions, not just obviously our fantastic guests, but from everyone. Okay. Oh, so what is very exciting today, we are going to be talking about design leadership with a fantastic old colleague of mine and a great design leader slash manager slash design person in general, Marianne. I always forget how to say your last name.
Guillen. It's French.
Guillen. Lovely, also French name there. And it's a real pleasure, and I'm so excited to have Marianne with us. As I said, we worked together briefly in Zalando, and I was really just so impressed by her impact on the community and on the organization and on the culture. And I just thought, you know, I have to get her for one of our events. I have to get some of this wisdom. So if anything, this is quite a selfish move, but I hope that we can share this learnings and insights with the community. And it is so good to have you here. Do you want to say a quick hello first?
Absolutely. Hello to everybody. I'm so impressed for all the different voices which come from all these different countries, like hello Estonia, Texas, Greece, like all the many different places. So thank you for joining in. And I'm really looking forward to this.
Just as we are also. So, of course, this is called Service Design Drinks Berlin. I am currently sitting in Portugal, so I have of course, my Vino Verde, but you can be drinking whatever you would like. If you would like milk or tea or just water or coffee, the different location, I guess, will depend on what kind of drink you're drinking. And as long as you have a drink in your hand, you're all right by us. I drink of any time. So cheers to all those that have a drink, and thank you for joining. The next thing is that we are, of course, a community that likes to celebrate design and service design specifically. And we would love to welcome everyone here. We try and be as inclusive and as welcoming to all people. And we really like that as part of our community. We love to meet people, bring people together. We like to level up, skill up, develop and mentor. We also have some members on the ADPA list, mentor list as well. Of course, sharing and learning. Thank you so much already for your great resources. Some fantastic books. The Making of a Manager is a great resource. And so we can already see some of those being added to the list. Thank you for sharing and learning together with us. And finally, we like to connect and have drinks, as we mentioned before. So very open community. We hope that this really brings you in and that you can also connect with some new people and learn some new stuff. So who's behind this? There's four of us. There's myself. Hello, I'm a service designer at Zalando. Then we have Dee.
Hi, I don't know if you can see me, and really nice to meet everyone. But actually, Adam, when my internet died, yeah, hi everyone. My internet just died for a second, and now I'm no longer co-host. Can you please give me those permissions so I can manage stuff for you while you're talking? But hi everyone, really nice to meet you.
And then we have our two lovely guests who are sitting out for this week. We have Mati Fro, who's also a senior service designer at Fjord. And we have Mela Robolino, who is a senior strategic designer at BCGDV. And we are all very excited. We've been doing this now for over a year, and we've had many great guests on, and we love and are honored by our position to run these events for the service design community. So what's happening today? We are going to have a fireside chat, a live podcast recording with Marianne here, who is going to share some wisdom about her journey to leadership in design, also some design operationalization, one of the most difficult words that I've just come into learning, and also about company culture. You also have some time to ask some questions. We want to leave some time at the end of the event, but we've already got so many fantastic questions from you all from the Eventbrite. Thank you so much for contributing that way already. Those questions were really fantastic, and we look forward to answering some of those as well. And then afterwards, for those that would like to stay around, we also have a networking. We can chat in some groups, but we also have the Wonder Me platform where we will join if you would like to hang around and network a little bit. And oh, I've gone too far. So let's get started. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and focus on our guest and all the people that are here. Of course, you're welcome to turn your cameras on or your microphones on when we welcome you. But we would love to get started with inviting our guests. So Marianne, let's get started with maybe an easy question. For those that don't know who you are and haven't stalked your LinkedIn or found you on Google yet, maybe you could tell us a little bit about who you are, what your current role is, and what does that role involve?
Okay. So my name is Marianne, and I lead a team which is called Design Platform at Spotify. And this is a team which is really intended to amplify design delivery across the platform. So the unique part about our team is that we not only own like certain aspects of the design, but we also own the product management and the engineering with it. So within my group, there's essentially like a group which focuses on accessibility. There's a group which focuses on design systems. There's a group which focuses on localization, a team which focuses on editorial design, which is essentially the cover art for each of our playlists. And most of these teams really work like across the global markets. So this is a team which is around like, I think about like 60, 70 people right now. And like I said, they basically host, they host always the design aspects of it, as well as like the engineering portion of it.
Maybe what does your role also involve in a day-to-day kind of aspect? Is it?
Yeah. What do I do with this?
Lots of responsibility, but
I know. So what do we do? So my job in this is a little bit. So my job, at least I see my job as like painting, help the teams in essence, like to paint sort of like the larger highways. It's like when I started visual merchandising, for example, I created a cover art for our playlists. And in the meantime, we probably want to think about how we can use image asset more on a strategic level. And these are the type of conversations I essentially have with the team. And then basically I see my role more as a support function of like removing roadblocks from them, like to ensure that they get the right resources they have, to basically work with them on like what the 2025 vision is going to look like, then potentially like help to see connecting dots. So for example, like when you think about artwork, that artwork needs to be localized, and that then in turn connects to localization, that also connects to the design systems portion of it, to basically facilitate these type of conversations to ensure teams have that awareness. I think this is probably like the majority of my job, I would say. So aside from that, I'm a people manager. So I essentially also spend time with like just on one-on-one conversations with each of the leads which work on my team. And then of course, like, my first team is not necessarily my team. So my first team is potentially my peers, because I sit within a platform unit. And that platform is a business unit who essentially looks after the cloud services, the engineering productivity. And here, while I'm responsible for looking out for design and design delivery aspects, they potentially look after engineering aspects or like, client platform or these type of things. So I oftentimes also synchronize with my peers in essence to see where the mission, vision and strategy goes to I think that's probably also a big part of my job. And then, of course, the third role is like in the larger Spotify ecosystem to build relationships with peers we need to work with. So whether this is the music business or the podcasting units or the core experience, it's like how all these things then tie together. And that hopefully paints a little bit of a picture of what I do.
Yeah, I like the Autobahn, the freeway metaphor the most, also to understand the vision and strategy, but also connecting with your circles and then building those relationships. It sounds like you also do a lot, I have to say, which is quite good. I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit in a second, but I wanted to get to know a little bit more on a personal level as well. So I have some rapid fire questions just as an introduction. So what is your favorite meal to have when you are sad or want to celebrate?
Honestly, I have a huge dependency on cappuccino. So I have this lovely coffee shop around the corner, which I probably visit at least twice a day because it gets me out of the house and I love cappuccino. So it works great.
Okay. If you were to invite anyone to dinner, who would it be?
I think probably like the women design leaders who came before me. Like I grew up in Chemnitz, which is like in the southern part of Eastern Germany. And as a 7-year-old, I was particularly scared by Marianne Brandt, because I don't know if you know her, she is a product designer, one of the very few and only ones at the Bauhaus. And I encountered her when she was in her late 80s. And she was this old woman with this 1920s haircut. And she had this fabulous like black gown. And she was very serious. And she walked with a cane. And she really, really scared me. But I will always remember this. And of course, nowadays, I would love to talk to her and just learn more about her experience, what it was like as a product designer during that time. And,
awesome.
It's like how her career and her life went.
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you, Dee. Dee will be linking the links if you want to find out a little bit more about these people. What is your most prized possession or most expensive possession?
Yeah, it's clearly my children. They do both.
Yeah, okay, yep. What was your first job, or what was the first thing you ever got paid for?
I was really lucky because I grew up in Eastern Germany before the wall came down. And I was studying at Weißensee. And when the wall came down, it was really clear that it's going to cause a lot of like changes, because in East Berlin, like as a designer, you're basically, your role was mostly around like designing books, designing theater works, like lots of like beautiful work, lettering work, not a lot of commercial work. And obviously the world was rapidly changing. And I was really at a loss because I knew this wasn't going to continue as we had intended it to be. So I needed to figure out like how to get a hang of this new world. And I ended up as a design intern at Design Pur, and Design Pur still exists. And Design Pur was sort of like born out of meta design, because I think when Eric founded meta design in the second round, he had a partner whose name was Hans-Werner Holzwart. So Hans-Werner worked at meta design, and this is where I landed. So Hans-Werner essentially really was somebody I'm super grateful for, because he took me on as an intern and taught me pretty much a lot about, or pretty much everything I needed to know at this time about design, as well as the studio altogether, like Anya and like who else was there. So to this day, I think I'm super grateful for that opportunity.
That is a great start. I guess this leads on to my next question. And also the first topic I want to talk about is your journey to your position now and your journey to your leadership. But to get started, I thought what would be an interesting question is if you could take 2 to 3 minutes to just give us a rundown of like your LinkedIn, your curriculum vitae, so to speak. Could you give us a quick spiel of when you went from this agency all the way to now?
Yeah, I think because Design Pur had this meta relationship, obviously like meta design in the late 90s was probably the most influential agency in Germany and probably abroad. So as young designers, we spent a lot of time there, and it was a very open house, also like, which I'm super grateful for, because you could just like walk up to somebody's desk and like talk to them about fonts, like, or I think Branchik and Nagel, by the time, they were like designing all the fun funks for the Love Parade and such. So it was always a really inspiring environment. And so I took a lot of that with me, and then shortly left for the US. And in the US, I felt like, so as a designer, I didn't know enough about technology. So I actually ended up in Silicon Valley, like really working with backend systems. So we essentially built like asset management systems, which hosted the first image asset library for Apple's marketing assets. Or we built like the first Adobe intranet or something like this, you know.
Can I just interject? Just the asset library. So you're also, I guess, person that helped find those images of the black silhouette with the white iPod images as well, and had somewhere to store those images. I guess you were part of that.
Well, I didn't have to do anything with the assets. We were just building the infrastructure, which was hosting the assets in Athens, you know. So, but it was an interesting time with Apple, because I think this was like just right around the time when Steve Jobs got back, and he basically asked, I think he bought CKS or something like this by the time. So so everything had to be like, Hiroki was the creative director back then. So anything you were doing with them had to be signed off by Hiroki. So I got to visit them as well. So it was quite fun. And then after a while, I realized that as a designer, I felt like I didn't knew enough about design. Like, you know, so I knew enough about technology in the meantime, but when you are in a tech environment, you don't necessarily have enough peers on the design side. So I went back and basically really like this time around, like ended up working at Meta Design, and that was the office in San Francisco. And the San Francisco office, at least to my experience, was quite different from the Berlin office. And it was right around the time when essentially these agencies had to deal with like digital environments, and oftentimes had a difficult time just to adapt into this digital world because it was so different from their print experience. And so in this particular instance, we were a bunch of like really young and ambitious designers and didn't have a whole lot of patience. So we decided like shortly thereafter that we felt like we could do this ourselves too, and left. And I'm really sorry for this to Meta. And I also had the opportunity at least to talk to some of the leaders, because this wasn't a very nice exit, and it was quite a few people at the same time. So we ended up founding this new company, which was called Method. And Method had offices in San Francisco, and then later in like a year later in New York. And I think they also had an office in London or something like this. So a lot of this digital design community basically came out of Method then. And that was like a very joyous, crazy ride, because it was in the beginning of the dot-com boom, and there was a lot of like work which inundated us, and we were all in our early 20s and had literally no experience whatsoever how to run an organization. So, so lots of very quick learnings, lots of fun, sometimes very challenging, very difficult situations. And like I said, I'm really sorry towards Meta's leadership who had to experience some of this. I'm also still really grateful to Meta's leadership for the type of things we actually did learn from them and copied diligently as we started to go in our own journey. And that was like, yeah, that's, I think, is one of the things which was really like, you know, it's like a deep memory for all the people who went through this adventure. And I think we still connect often and like have good memories of all of this.
Sounds like also a great tip for leadership in general, also to learn from and steal and copy diligently.
We definitely copied a lot. Of course, by knowing everything better, right? So and after this, I think I was in a situation that I really wanted to have children. So I sort of like entered this age as a young mother, and then it's probably for most women and female designers a difficult time, because you're balancing your kids and your work. So I ended up consulting for many years, and sometimes was really lucky that I found environments or people who were supportive of a situation like this. So there was an agency in Seattle who was a temp agency, but they essentially put teams together, like really like more senior type teams, who then worked with companies like Microsoft to really accomplish bigger projects. And so they essentially gave you a team and then you could run with it. And that was quite useful, and I really loved it. So in this context, I sort of like worked on the first user interface, human interface guidelines for Microsoft Live. By that time, they just really had stored their assets on like their machines within their design center. They had like, I think it was about 300 designers or something like this. So it was quite chaotic. So this was like the first attempt to get orderly, nicely organized web guidelines. That was a lot of fun. And because it worked quite well, they came back about a year later to have me do the same thing for Office Live. And so now I had essentially like a little bit of this connection from like the print work, which I knew from meta design and these really like big corporate print guidelines. And it sort of like brought me into this digital environment to gain experience within these corporate, like corporate human interface guidelines. So it was kind of like an interesting shift to observe from the print guidelines to the human interface guidelines into this world, what we call today as design systems, and how to sort of like morphed. And after I returned back to Silicon, to the Bay Area, in essence, then I took a really short stint at Ring Central, which was a voice telecom company, and there I was like essentially like I worked as a designer, as a UX designer. And this was interesting because it was really like taking out the telecom industry and trying to use voice over IP like through the internet. And it was just technically a really challenging and interesting environment because of the telecommunications portion plus the design portion on it. And then that brought me essentially to Intuit. And Intuit was also a journey which I really liked, because I think Intuit is a great company just from a leadership perspective. And I think a lot of like what I know about leadership, I really started to learn there. And there I worked as a principal designer, like within the design systems team for QuickBooks, and try to help them to basically synchronize the guidelines from QuickBooks all the way to Intuit to simplify the design systems. So we, for example, could identify 5 headline fonts and 5 text fonts for all their flagship products. And to really also take much more like in old meta design fashion, much more of a mathematical approach, how we run design systems. Yeah, that was probably like 5 years of my life or something like this. And then I needed to go home because my home base is Berlin, and I needed to take care of my parents and visit my mother. And so this brought me back to Berlin. And in Berlin, I spent some time to help Zalando to basically build out the Zalando design system. And so we did that, and then basically Spotify knocked on my door, which then brought me to my current position.
Okay, wow. That's, I think one of the things, like in terms of a journey to leadership, is that you, like when you reflect, you did so much. Like it's sometimes you really forget that I think in a junior position or even a senior position, you forget like you're only at the start right now. And with that experience, like it's quite a journey to get where you are now. One question that I have on top of my mind is like looking back maybe of your time with Meta or when you left Meta to now working in design, what is like one of the biggest maybe mental shifts or ways that you think differently or differences that you have in terms of who you are from then to now? Is that a fair question?
I mean, one of the things like actually which I learned at Intuit was like that agencies in essence are small businesses. So that means like they have small business issues. You know, one of the things an agency typically struggles with is just cash flow. That's just a small business issue. And that sort of like creates a certain type of environment of how you work, you know, because in essence, like you have a project, and even if you want to do this fabulous project, like the project will end at some point and then the new client comes, and that's a specific way of working. On the one hand, it allows you to essentially like really focus more on craftsmanship, which you potentially not have in a corporate environment. But it also doesn't have the longevity to essentially pursue an aspect over multiple years, you know, or over multiple like phases in a development. So these, I think, are just fundamental issues. And I think as a designer, it's interesting for you to decide of which stage in your career are you at, and like what are the type of things which are important to you. You know, each of these environments essentially has something to offer which could potentially be useful to you. And in a corporate environment, of course, like I'm much more adhering, like on the one hand, I clearly will never let go of quality. Like that's a really important aspect no matter what. But I also have a lot of business colleagues, and I have to essentially translate how I want to channel my design aspirations or like, you know, needs or things I think are important to the product or to the business. And I have to translate this into a language they can hear me. So meaning like I have to adapt much more to a business type of language in order to translate, you know, to go back and forth and translate my design issues in essence.
I guess that goes to one of the questions we got from the crowd from the Eventbrite, is like, how do you balance the creativity of the profession with the business needs and the culture and also doing your craft? Like, how have you found that now in this leadership position, or how have you found that through the different stages of your leadership development?
I think, you know, I do think, you know, as a designer, like, I think the crafts aspect of it, like, is something you just, at least in my world, you know, it's like, it's something you just nurture constantly, like, because that's it. That's like, you know, it's like, if I walk down the street, I look at things, I evaluate things, I look at other people's work, you know, so I just have a natural interest on it. Like, so it will never go away. Like, that's just something which is in your DNA to a degree, right? Your corporate setting sort of like expects you to facilitate that, like it expects you already have it, you know. So then it depends on what organization you're in. Like some organizations spend a lot of time to basically cultivate craft. Like, so I think Airbnb is a good example, you know, where they essentially have like entire craft shops for you to continuously cultivate it. So to me, it's sort of like to add on this business aspect so I can speak that language and also like use the language in a sense so I can achieve design goals. That was quite challenging because it's not trained anywhere. You know, this isn't something I can go to design school for and get taught how to, you know, how to use an MBA language or something like this. And that I found kind of like challenging and interesting, but I always look at this like more as a sport. You know, for me, this is a new skill I need to adapt to. So this is a sport of like, how can I acquire this skill in essence, you know, in order to maneuver this. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, for sure.
Can I jump onto that question as well? As with this balancing of the creativity and the business side, that's for you personally, you answered that really well. That was wonderful. But I'd also love to know, as a leader, as a manager, how do you balance the people that you're responsible for, the people that you manage, the business needs and their ability to be creative, or your desire to have the team do creative work, but having to do what the business wants as well?
Yeah. I think you know, it's oftentimes like a lot of it has to do with conversations, you know, and it's an ongoing conversation because like I, for example, like need to make the space that my design team has like 6 weeks to do an in-depth like exploration where nobody can see an outcome immediately from it, you know. But for us as designers to have this room to explore is super important. So I essentially need to prepare my business partners like that this is something we need to do, like, and even so, like there's no measurable outcome for you in the moment, you know. So this is essentially a long-term investment you have to make in order to achieve quality. And this is essentially like, that's a conversation I need to prepare. So I need to essentially prepare, like, and also show them the differences in essence, you know. So oftentimes design gets used as an execution mechanism, meaning like, you know, here comes somebody and says like, I have this UI and here's the wireframe. I need somebody to make this, you know, look decently so people can use it. So that to me is the tactical aspect of design. But then I basically need to argue to them, it's like, you're only using design to a certain degree. You're not using the strategic portion of this. And because you're not doing this, you know, you potentially shooting yourself in the foot in some other aspect because you didn't use it this way. So these are just, you know, ongoing education efforts I need to make. And at the same time, also protect my teams, you know, to make sure they have the space. In some cases, I also just basically need to make a decision and say like, this is how we're going to do things. So it's a balance, you know, it's just a balancing act all around it, how you do that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's like one of the true qualities of a design leader. And that's what I would say is a key role of the design leader in this way. And maybe on that as well, like, I want to like ask you about the structures that you have in place to make sure that you can do that But I also wanted to ask, there's two questions. The first one would be about the structure, about how you structure your teams, how you actually develop these people that are underneath you and stuff. But then also laterally, you asked about, like you said, about like your peers and working with your peers. So how do you educate people that maybe don't understand design, or even in like non-design driven organizations? How do you do this? How do you get it appreciated? How do you get them to understand your role or your team's role or design's role? Maybe let's start with that one. How do you do this with your peers, like at eye level developers and things like this? Yeah.
I mean, it depends on what kind. I sit in a really really serious tech team. It's like, so in a back-end infrastructure team. So there's basically very little or like very low design maturity. So I think by the time we started, we realized that the tech teams essentially realized that they needed to have designers to create UIs for all kinds of reasons, to basically navigate their systems better. And round one was for us, in essence, like we got the headcount to essentially hire designers. So that's the beginning of it, and I think that often is where you start. And then you just need to acknowledge that the design maturity is like relatively low. Yeah. And so for like, and partially it's a patience issue, it's like you just need to be clear. And I also like try to be with my peers always clear where we're at. You just hire designers, meaning like you're just getting used to knowing how to utilize these designers in a good way, So, and then I basically also like propose things to them or give them opportunities to think about, So right now your designers essentially like really focusing to solve certain like individual screens. That's great, because it will make the screen better. But ultimately what it's not going to give you is like how the products connect with each other, so that horizontal like layer of like orientation. So there's some consistency around it, like, and that's something people oftentimes are interested in. So now they start to essentially pay attention. It's like, hey, there is some value I'm not getting. You're telling me there's a value I have in terms of this designer in essence, and I'm not getting the value. So I want the value, of course. So, so then I have, so then I can say like, okay, so in order to make this happen, we either need to stuff up the team, or we need to utilize this team better, or you need to make sure that these team members are in the right conversations, because right now they don't have the right context. So it's essentially to basically acknowledging the growth of this story, like, and basically understanding the right level of this. And then essentially it's like slowly helping the teams to up level this conversation, so helping the designers to take bigger stakes, having the stakeholders to see more, to ask for more. So it's a bit of a conversation. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, of course, I would assume that you have a lot of interesting and creative and I don't know, patient conversations. I also learned this at your time at Zalando, and the way that you took on a lot of these conversations. It was quite fantastic. I would say we have a question on the other part of my question from before, Alex. Alex asks, do you have any suggestions for resources for designers looking to develop business skills and language, like how to talk to your stakeholders, to your peers? Do you have resources or suggestions for that? Or is it mostly learning on the job?
A lot of it is learning on the job, but I also like, I mean, I at some point actually took like business classes, because I just like, to me, there was sort of like a day where I woke up and realized, like, typically in the US, the entire business world is ruled by Harvard, at least like in my naive designer understanding, that's how this went, And then I figured like, okay, typically like these big universities, they use certain types of frameworks and concepts of how they think about business. So it couldn't be that hard. I have no money for this, I can't get an MBA. It's not going to happen. Like, I just need to figure out creatively how I acquire these skills without having to pay like endless amount of money to get this business degree, So I essentially understood, okay, like there's certain frameworks they use, and they systematically show up within like US businesses in essence, like how they think about analyzing a problem, how they go about innovation and that sort of thing. So Coursera, for example, is a very cheap place where you can get a lot of this. You can just basically go and take the classes. I'm sure like LinkedIn has it too. So it's really just like following the narrative you hear from your product managers and how they talk about this, and then essentially like go and like take the class and like, understand what the language is about, because it's a pattern issue and it's a language issue to a large degree. That's at least in my designer understanding as a systems designer, that's how I approached it. And it's been working,
logical.
you know.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
So I just, at some point, I was just tired to basically, you know, take this, you know, when you, as a designer, like you were confronted by like 10 product managers and they all speak this economic language, which I have no access to. And it's quite intimidating, you know, and at some point I wasn't willing to take this intimidation any longer. And I just needed to break through this. And that was my way to essentially like just cut this and like, okay, you guys are also just human and you're going to use some type of language and framework. And I just need to figure out what this is. And that has been super helpful. Like, and ever since I started to adapt to that language, you know, makes a huge difference.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I would also like to, maybe another question that I'd like to ask on this in terms of understanding the business language, but also in understanding our language. For designers, what do you think is that maybe someone who's a junior designer or mid-level designer, they're kind of like learning who they are, their skills, their positions. But as a leader, you often are explaining what the value of design is, what we do, etc. What is maybe something that a lot of designers don't realize is their value, or how do you, yeah, I'll leave it like that.
Well, what I oftentimes see is like designers, when they basically meet counterparts, you know, they're essentially making a design request to a product manager. Like, you know, so for example, like we need to have a discovery phase. That means nothing to that product manager. Like they have no idea what you just ask, you know.
Yeah.
So I would probably try to translate this into something this person can actually hear, or better even, like, you know, before you get started in working with them, to basically just take a stop and just align on vocabulary, you know, just align on concepts, or like give an introduction, like here is a designer and here's me and this is how I work. And here's you, and here's how I assume you work, you know. So just basically level set, like just, you know, terms, terminologies, like expectations and such a thing. And I think oftentimes we don't take that time. We basically just get thrown into a situation where we have to deliver work on a specific deadline or something like this. And everybody tries with their best intentions to get things done, right? So, but like middle through the conversation, we just realizing we didn't even hear each other, you know, because the designer is basically talking about like, well, then we should have a vision for this product. And the product manager is already frantic because they need to deliver something within the next 3 weeks, you know. So there's just a huge disconnect. And I think acknowledging that there is this disconnect and basically just stopping and like as a human being, just basically saying like, okay, listen, like in order for me to be a good partner to you, I need this. And in order for you to be a good partner to me, you need this, right? So how do we essentially like sequence this so we both get to do our job to the best ability? So.
Yeah, I actually just got this exact feedback, so I definitely know it to be true. Well, fantastic. Dee, is there any questions from the crowd that you'd like to ask?
Yes, there's a great one. And I want to know the answer to this too. And Raul, if you want to, you don't have to at all, but you can, if you want to, you can switch on your camera and mic, or just your mic, and ask it. But if we don't see you, hear you in the next 10 seconds.
I would say go for it.
I'll just say it, but jump in if you want, Raul. Raul asks, I think the question is about why does it seem to be, and more in the last years especially, that these hybrid designers are more sought after, that can code UX, UI, and what do you think about that as a design leader? What do you think about that trend that people are looking for these hybrids?
In the tech world, they call this T-shapedness. Like, you know, that phenomenon doesn't only exist in design, it exists in engineering as well, and it's called T-shapedness. And oftentimes it has to do with that companies pivot so quickly between certain aspects of it, so that they can't just stuff a whole team, like, you know, so they essentially need to have some type of flexibility. I think in the UX world, like it's typical that a UX designer can pivot and like a little bit into service design or something like this. I think this is much more common and not an unusual situation. I think the part which is going to suffer on this, because it just operates very differently, is visual design. And visual design in particular, because when you look at an enterprise level organization, like the amount of visual designers you have is probably like 20% versus 80% of UX designers, right? And visual design is a craft in a sense that it gets better as you practice it more often. I mean, that applies to all of design, but I think visual design is a little bit of different because it just needs to get nurtured by practicing it, by having this little bit of like craftsmanship and mastership and that sort of thing, that's not something you can just easily switch back and forth. Like this won't work, So, and I don't think this is often understood. So I think if you have a set of like art directors or visual designers on your team, like the way you deal with them is very differently. It's oftentimes when we have performance reviews for designers, we sort of like have this formula which then applies to all of design, which I don't think is really helpful either, because a visual designer, if they're particularly good at it, they do this by practicing by themselves how to be a visual designer, so they may not be the greatest presenter because that's not what they do, So even so we expect all designers to have some kind of presentation skills, like I just need to really be mindful of the craftsmanship and the specialty they have and what they're good at, and also make sure I place them within the team and in the work accurately so they can actually be their best and perform at the best of their abilities.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's really nice to hear this perspective because as designers we hear like, oh, should I learn to code, or should I increase my skills in this other area as well? Will I have more opportunities for jobs? And it's really nice to hear this in-depth experience from the other side almost. And Raul, let us know if there was more to this question, and if that answered it. Adam, do you want to go on to?
Let's go on. So I think the last one, the one we wanted to talk about was company culture and leadership. And I think actually Martin's question is kind of exactly in line with what the questions was that we were going to ask. And Martin asked, so in today's business world, it seems like people's time within a company is getting shorter and shorter, maybe 6 months to 2 years. I would say that's also true for my career thus far as well. From your point of view, from a leadership point of view, and from a company point of view, how do you keep people engaged? Is it okay that there's this transition or fluidity? How do you also reduce that average, or if it's a good thing or a bad thing? And how do you look at it different aspects in terms of empowerment or freedom, creativity, their role, their routine, responsibility? How have you done that throughout the different positions, maybe also from agency to in-house? Or how does that affect also your team health and culture?
I do think it operates differently for agencies, to be honest. Like, I think the longevity in agencies typically is a little longer, because people typically attach to a specific type of community. And then if it works for them, then that could work for them many years. I know people who've been with certain type of agencies for a long time. I think in a corporate environment we have the same expectations that people switch their positions every 2 years. We try to retain them at Spotify. So we basically built like in the internal systems, like we assume that you essentially will then migrate to a different position. So to basically facilitate better this process of people moving around instead of them leaving in essence, that seems to work quite well. I personally try to for a design project, like it's quite difficult if the engagement is so short. I find it rather difficult because you can't really follow a strategy so for example, like it takes you about 2 years if you make a brand change to roll out this brand change. And if that team who was facilitating this brand change leaves after 2 years, you never get the whole rollout in essence, So, and I think that's also something you can see oftentimes in product developments, that this cycle is too short. It doesn't roll out correctly, then it doesn't get executed correctly. So then the next thing comes along, So there's a lot of like fluctuation within products, which doesn't necessarily make great products. So to me, I do think to me it's much more to be thoughtful about like how you position your designers in what capacity, to make sure that they have enough room for growth, so they're really set up for success in a sense. And to me, this is also like, it's an ongoing conversation with them, so to make sure it feels right on both sides.
Yeah.
And then I think like one of the bigger issues, which is not necessarily clear to people, is like when we structure teams, we always look first from the business need, so the business essentially needs like 3 junior designers and 2 seniors to figure out the strategy and that sort of thing. So now if you hire for these positions, you could end up with like 5 very senior people. That doesn't change the roles within the setup, so the roles are still the same, 3 juniors, 2 seniors, right? So essentially you have like at least like 3 seniors who are sitting in positions which are not adequate to their skill set. And that obviously then crashes, because they could do a lot more and the space they're actually operating in is way too narrow. And that just makes you really unhappy. So I think a lot of the situation why you see people leaving has to do with that either the expectation didn't match from when you were hired. So that's typically like the highest attrition rate. Or like even like as you're placed in a specific position, then the ability you have as an individual doesn't match with that.
Apologies. Heads up on the dog.
I want to join the call too.
Why are you leaving me out?
Yeah. I put in.
Sorry about that.
Not a problem.
They typically have to sit really nicely next to me. All right. So there's typically, there could be easily a mismatch, and that may be something like as an individual also to really watch out, like as you are interviewing for a position, like to really talk about the role, like what is this role actually allowing me to do and what's the growth trajectory for this role, so to make sure this is a good match between like your skill set and what you can bring to the table, and if that role actually allows you to really execute correctly.
Yeah. I think that's also good. I hope a lot of designers have that conversation, even with their leadership today, even in roles currently. I think if this is untransparent or intransparent or unclear, it's a great conversation to have with people. Also, when you're in a very boxed in place, it also causes a lot of attrition to keep. Maybe on that, in terms of attrition or not fitting in the place that you're in, what are some other red flags that you have for culture, or that pushes people out of your team, or that kind of creates instability? Maybe. Other red flags?
I mean, generally, like when I would interview for a new role, like company culture is really important to me. Like, so because the tone which comes from the top is sort of like dictating like the type of things you can do, like that makes a big difference. So that's something I would probably be more thoughtful about than I have been previously. And then, like I said, in any type of interview conversation, I would always like really check on what this role, like what is the growth trajectory for this role, So the hiring manager, in essence, if they don't have a good plan of like how this role will unfold, then obviously like when I'm in the role, like that also won't work really well, So that I think is really like, to me, that's the biggest disconnect typically, and something to really look into. And then it's also like, as a leader, in essence, like as I build out my team, I try to make sure that if I put certain structures in place, that the structures are able to grow, that I'm not just saying like, okay, I need a manager for this team. So then what's the manager going to do like 2 years from now? And maybe the manager's role will change, but I already need to have some kind of like strategic workforce planning in my head, or like at least in collaboration with my teammates, to have a good understanding where this role will evolve into. And then is that a good opportunity for this person who sits in the role to essentially grow with the role? Is that the right setup, and like those type of considerations?
Yeah. Okay, we're going to wrap up because we're almost out of time. So I've got a couple of questions that I wanted to wrap up with that also came from the crowd from the Eventbrite. I love the trajectory of this role is a great interview question. So that's definitely one you should put in your notebook when you go to interviews or talk with your one-on-one leaders. So maybe one thing on a more personal level is maybe you can tell us of a leadership mistake that you've made and what you learned from it. And so that's the first question. And then the second one is, I'll ask that one in a second. So maybe you can tell us about maybe under the coat, like behind the scenes, if there's been a leadership mistake and what you learned.
I've made tons of them, like, I mean, glorious fails, like absolutely on all kinds of levels. I think, when I was younger, I think just gloriously overestimating what I could do. Like that was really a fun one. I think oftentimes it's also like with all good intentions, you could potentially like put something out to your community or to your team, and this could be completely received differently on the receiving end. That's probably like, so I might say something and I just need to be cognizant of that how that's going to be received on the receiving end is something completely different. So to tailor my messaging correctly. So for example, like I could, I have a tendency, for example, like to think like 3 years ahead. So, and I could have a conversation with somebody and then they essentially turn around and go to that team and says like, okay, we need to implement this right now. And I'm like, no. Like, that's a good one. So, but I think there's probably an endless list of things I could share is my guess.
I think also in that, in terms of, hey, I'm communicating of this vision. This is where I'd like to go in the future. This is the direction, and phrasing and contextualizing your communication.
Yeah.
We are, so I would say, well, I am also terrible as a designer of doing this and getting super excited, ambitious, over expectations and stuff, and not contextualizing anything that I'm talking about. So the importance is how it lands, and I think that's a really important thing. So one final question, maybe for the people in the crowd as well as also for me, is if you don't have a formal position of leadership in terms of you're not a manager yet or you're not a principal, how could you explore if that's a path for you? Like how can a young junior, senior looking to develop in design and expand and grow, how can they start to test this out if this is a track for them?
I mean, there's really like two different aspects. One is management and the other one is leadership, and there's a big difference. So because in essence, like leadership is something anybody could do. It's like in your environment, you can essentially take on certain responsibilities or types of conversations which essentially bring you to leadership or have you lead certain aspects of it. So on the management side, that's typically a conversation you should really have with your managers. Like in organizations where I worked, it's quite common that you have choices. It's like the question is actually put to you, like, do you feel more like this is a pathway for you, or the one of an individual contributor? And I've seen cases where people went back and forth. They tried management for a while, wasn't for them, and then essentially like took on a back of an IC role. So I think at least at our size, like organizations should have that flexibility to give people this opportunity, at least to try it out and see if it's for them, and then to potentially like realize this wasn't for them. So if I place somebody in a role, that doesn't necessarily mean this works. So sometimes I'm hoping it will work, but like sometimes they just realize this wasn't working. So, but in terms of leadership, like and leadership is also like, is great because in a sense, it just trains you to potentially take on management roles. So you could basically just try this within the project you were given or within your squad or wherever your team or that type of thing. That's just an ownership you can essentially take on and just go with it and run with it. And I'm assuming like most tech companies are super grateful for anybody who takes initiative because that's what they live off.
Yeah, for sure. Yes. Could not have said it better myself. So yeah, I think, I mean, that there is 100 more questions that we could ask, and if we had all day, I'm sure we could talk all day, but we need to stop somewhere. Otherwise we'll make a very boring event, but it's been an absolute pleasure. And we also asked in the Eventbrite, what is the biggest challenge when it comes to design leadership that people are feeling today? And I think this alignment, feeling prepared enough, even like how to get the value, the importance of balance. We've covered some of those, and we can see, I can also see by your experience and the journey that, also in myself, just to calm down, take a breath. It's a journey. It's not a race. There's no, end goal. You develop over time. And I think that's an amazing takeaway, as well as, thinking about how it lands, teaching, educating, communicating. These are all fantastic things. Yeah, there's also things about regular mentorship and knowledge management and stealing and copying, I think is also a great thing to do from what you did for meta design, also taking that with you forward. So it's fantastic. Maybe if there's a question or one final comment from you, Marianne?
Between all of this, I think to keep the passion, I think is sort of like, I have, I love what I do. I love working with the teams I work with. I do think we have amazing opportunities. And I think that passion is really important. And sometimes it took me, when I was like, there were moments in my career where I thought like, I can't stand it any longer. This is so ridiculous. Like I got to do something else. So I ended up like drumming or like, go off and do something completely different for a while. But I do think that's also important, like just like if it doesn't work for you, for the moment, just step out and try something else creative, and then to reinvigorate in essence, like the type of things you're passionate about. So, and if that job you're in is not giving you that, or like it doesn't have this trajectory, then maybe it's not the right position, so then maybe it's time to really look for a setup where you're better supported. But I do think like good design, has to have some joy and happiness and fun. So that's something you probably want to preserve.
Yeah, that's a great reminder.
I love that so much. I just wrote that quote in the chat as well. Like if something doesn't work for you right now, step out and try something else creative. It's like we don't think to do that. We just push harder and try and make things work. Yeah, thanks. I love that one.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my.
And